Okay, this will be Tommy for.
Tell Carrie about his license plate, because Carrie's never heard.
Oh, yeah. Okay. At some point, Fred got a license plate that said TV star. And I don't know where that came from, but that was just one of Fred's ideas. And of course, everywhere he drove, people would see it and think, who was that? And I remember one time we recorded a record in Nashville, and we were staying at the Marriott down there, and Fred, for some reason I remember this, he came driving up in his car with TV star, and people, I just remembered people's reactions, because they would go out and see that, and then they'd go in and look and see who was driving, and then they'd look at each other like, I don't know who this guy is. And but I don't know, that was just one of Fred's ways of attracting attention. He liked for people to know who he was.
Fred died a very untimely
Yes.
death.
Yep.
And there was a movement to create an advertising scholarship fund in his memory, which still exists.
Yeah.
It isn't given out every year, but neither is the silver medal, for that matter. As someone who was really close to Fred, how does that make you feel? Why is that appropriate, that there be a scholarship fund to remember him and his contribution?
Well, Fred was a major influence in Roanoke advertising. He was.
Can you start that again? I think I talked over you.
Oh, okay.
Fred
Excuse me. Fred was a major influence in Roanoke advertising. He was one of the early guys that started out a lot of things, and he innovated a lot of things. He was just a major force in Roanoke advertising. Even after, he was with several agencies. After we did creative, that broke off into image advertising, and they handled the Berglund account. And he was Berglund's spokesman on TV, and everybody, they ran those spots all the time. And even if people didn't know who Fred was from the band or from the radio or whatever, they found, he became quite familiar to them just even through that. So, plus he was a great guy. He was just he was a very unique, special person. And for that reason, I think it was a great idea to do the scholarship fund.
Tell me about the evolution. As you've seen it through your career, which you're 40 years into it now?
Oh, so something like that.
Yeah. Tell me about the evolution that you've seen, the jingle and its usage, because you follow the pulse of it. You've been a part of it.
Well, it's funny the way that jingles have evolved over the years, and the way, as being in advertising, that you kind of go with what's cool at the time. Like right now, the big thing with music and advertising is to use familiar hits from the past or the present. Very few actual jingles are done these days, using the client's name in the jingle and that kind of thing. There was a time when that was the coolest thing to do, to do a full jingle with the client's name in the jingle, and really specifically for that client. And then there's been times when various kinds of music have been used. Of course, in this day and age, there's so much library music that's cheap, that people can go online and get for a very small amount of money. And jingles, when we were doing them, they weren't cheap, because the word jingle has a certain connotation. But I like to think that what we did was like mini songs, because we went to the big studios in Atlanta and Nashville and used musicians that were doing hit records. Really top-notch musicians. And And so, you know, it was quite expensive. We had to pay all the musicians, had to pay the studio cost and travel and that whole bit, and try to make a little bit of money on it at the same time. These days, you've got computers that, as I was telling you earlier, you know, kids can actually put together little pieces because, you know, everything, you've got the software on the computer and just about anybody can put something together, even if you're not a musician. A lot of it's pretty bad, but some of it's not bad. Some of it's pretty good. So it's changed quite a bit over the time since I've started doing it, for sure.
I'm trying to recollect. You know, you've got these two. You've got these two personas. There's Tommy Holcomb, the guy who helped.
Not too many lights, you know.
Yeah, tell me how you got started. Tell me how your interest in music got started.
Well, you know, I think that's an inborn thing. I always liked music ever since I was just a little kid, and I started taking piano at age 6, and took for about 10 years and got to be pretty good on classical. My teacher taught me classical, you know, and near the end I was playing these real hard songs. And but then, you know, as a teenager, I got kind of tired of that and picked up the guitar, and we started, you know, the Kingston Trio folk music was big back then, and so we started the Vikings band, and so then later on I played guitar and keyboards in the bands I was in. So.
Did you just pick up the other instruments, or did you formally learn guitar or whatever?
Never formally learned, no. Just kind of picked that up on my own. So, and I never was a great guitar player. You know, it was just strumming stuff. You know, but no lead kind of thing. No Eric Clapton there.
Right, right. When did you first figure out that your gift for music was a workable gift that had something in common with advertising and marketing? When did the jingle?
Well, I got involved. Well, one of my good friends, as you know, was Fred Freelance, and he was at WROV, and there was another guy there named John Hartman, who was the copywriter down there, and the three of us started this little small thing called Fresh Air. There was later another thing called Fresh Air here in Roanoke, another company called Fresh Air. But it was just three of us, and we did a few. Fred produced, John wrote, and I did a little music for that. But then we started Creative Advertising, which was a small agency that ended up really having just most of the local main retail clients in Roanoke. And but John Hartman said, okay, you know music, why don't you write a jingle? And it was for Smartwear. I don't know if you remember that. There was a place called Smartwear. It was a women's store down on Jefferson Street. And I wrote it, and we recorded it. I had some of our band, the Vikings, Joy in the Vikings sang lead on it, and we recorded it down at Ed Purcell's studio at Associated Studios down below where you worked. And the thing we didn't even know what the Addy Awards were then. And Frank Bierman, who worked for Davidson's, who was another one of our clients, said, you guys ought to go to the Addy Awards this year, because he'd been on the committee, the Addy Awards committee. And we didn't even know what they were, you know, and we said, well, okay. So we went to it, and darn if that jingle didn't win Best Commercial of the Year. And we were all, me especially, I was incredibly amazed. I thought, my gosh, you know. And so I started doing jingles and at Creative Advertising for a lot of our clients, the Lindy's and I don't know, all those clients. And then I broke off after a couple of years and started my own company and started doing jingles for, you know, whoever wanted them. And so that's how that started.
Creative advertising was kind of a hot shop for a while. I mean, you know, they had good people, they had good creatives. It was a different world then, in that there was so much more. You know, even when I started, everybody would say, "Oh, it's a big deal. Leather House is looking for a new agency." Well, Leather House is still
Yeah.
in business, but I'll bet I spend more on baseball cards in a year than they do on advertising. You know. What was it like to be young and to be in this exciting field and kind of cool field and with a bunch of other young folks?
It was great, and of course, John and Fred were great friends of mine. So but see, John Hartman, you have to understand, John Hartman really was responsible. None of us really knew what we were doing. Fred was a producer at WROV and was excellent at doing radios. Anyway, but I was getting ready to say that John really was responsible for bringing a lot of advertising, very creative people together. Bill Tanger was John's friend. He brought him to Roanoke. And Andy Klingenpeel, who was a fine artist, is a fine artist and photographer. And Sharon Meharry, who was married to Fred for a while back then, but she went on to do great things in advertising all over the country, and many others too. I know I'm leaving a lot of people out, but creative was a really interesting thing because, like I say, half the time we didn't know what we were doing, and truthfully, that was one of the good things, because once you learn the rules, it kind of inhibits your creativity, I think, and because oh gosh, we shouldn't do this because so and so and so. But then we didn't even think like that. We just did it. If we had an idea, we just did the TV spot or did the radio spot or whatever. So, like I say, some of them turned out really well. Some of them turned out really horribly, but we, all of a sudden we were winning all these awards and nobody knew exactly why, but we just kept doing it, and it was a fun time. It was a really fun time in my life. That's when I met my first wife, Rita, who was the Sydney's girl. She was on the back page of the entertainment section of the newspaper every Saturday, full page ad, and so it was quite a good time in my life. That's when I learned a lot during those years.
Tell me about some of the clients.
Lindy's was one of the, Lindy's was a classic restaurant. Older people don't remember Lindy's, younger people certainly do because they spent a lot of their time there. And yeah, I got to work, Lindy's had the franchise for Kentucky Fried Chicken, and the Colonel would come to town, and Fred and I were kind of assigned to take him around to the different Lindy's and that kind of thing. So spent a lot of time with the Colonel, and gosh, I don't know. It's been a long time. I'm trying to remember our clients. Of course, there was a Smartwear, the jingle that I did. Bob Bell Pontiac. I'm trying to remember what jingles I did back then. I'll think of some more in a little while. I gave it,
Oh, sure.
You hit me with that. I should have thought of that before.
We're not in any hurry here.
Yeah.
Tell me about Fred. Tell me about Fred Freelance. What was special about him? What was crazy about him? Tell me about his license plate, his persona, and
His
what
license
you
plate.
remember about him.
Well, when I was a senior in high school, this is back in 61, 62, Fred was on the air at WROV, and I remember listening to him in the mornings and really liked him a lot. I just liked the guy. He was really good on the air. Then I went off to college. I never did meet him until 1966, and we just immediately hit it off. We had the same likes, and we were both single, and we became hard and fast drinking buddies. We went out a lot to some of the local places, And but early on, I realized that Fred was a special kind of guy. I remember we used to drive around. He had a Thunderbird, and he had a telephone receiver with a little, wire that came down. Of course, there was nothing at the other end of the wire, but he'd go down Jefferson Street and pick up the phone and just start talking, And so people would look, hey, he's got a telephone in his car. one thing I remember is Fred and I used to love to go to Howard Johnson's to get their clam dinner. I don't know, we just liked their clam dinner. And one time we went out there, and he took, first of all, he had a little portable black and white TV that was run by batteries. And he took that out there because Wanted Dead or Alive was on that night. And he didn't want to miss it. So we took it out there and we were watching the Wanted Dead or Alive, which people were kind of looking at us anyway. But Fred said, "Excuse me, got to make a phone call." And he got up and he called somebody on the payphone at Howard Johnson's. And then he came back and sat down. And a minute or so later, they yelled, "Telephone for Fred Freelance." And Fred said, "That's me." He made a big deal of answering the phone. Everybody looked around like, what's going on? And then he came back a couple of minutes later. I said, "Fred, who in the world was calling you at Howard Johnson's?" He said, "Oh, that was me." He said, "I called myself, just so they'd, you know." But that was Fred. He just did, I mean, I could go on and on with Fred's stories. Everywhere.
Break for just a second.
Somebody was asking for me. Rolling, this will be take 3. Tommy?
But I was going to tell the story I was going to say that Fred was always the center of attention wherever we went. He just had a way of doing that. And I mean, even when the band went out of town, see, Fred was in the band, as you well know, the Vikings. And when the band went out of town, he found ways to bring attention to himself. And it was all harmless. He never did anything, Fred never did anything to hurt anybody. He had the biggest heart in the world. But he just did all these funny things. And one time the band went to Hilton Head, and we were at Sea Pines. And we were taking one of those boat trips around the harbor at Harbor Town at Sea Pines. You know, every port has one of those things. But we were on the second level of this boat, and stand around at the front talking, and all of a sudden Fred, out of nowhere, just turned around, and there were probably 50 people up there, out of nowhere said, "I am your captain," and he was talking in a German accent, and everybody looked up, and he just went into this monologue that was hilarious. I mean, I don't even know where it came from. He probably didn't know where it came from. And you know, people were looking at each other like, "Who's this?" And some of them were laughing and some of them were puzzled. But and on that same trip, I remember he was at the bow of the ship where it comes together up the front of the ship. I don't know anything about ships, but he was right most of the trip. He was standing there, and the wind was Fred used hairspray, and the wind was kind of doing his hair like that. And when the trip was over, his hair was still like if he had a fan in front of his face. And I said, "Fred, you know, you really ought to comb your hair." He said, "Nah, just leave it." And so we went out to eat and went out to different places, and he looked like he had a fan in front of his face, the whole, you know. But that was just Fred. He was just, I have a million Fred stories, but too many for this interview. But he was just a great guy. The thing about Fred is he treated bank presidents exactly the same as he did people on the street, you know. I mean, just everybody, or you know, drunks in the alley. You know, he treated them all exactly the same way.
Excuse me, I'm going to put a stop to that. Tommy Holcomb, the musician, both of them are pretty fascinating guys. Do you remember, I'm trying to recall, did you play the Dudley Moore reception when they did Crazy People here, and there was the amazing rain that he was supposed to show up? He showed up drunk, and I didn't. They had to move it into a parking garage.
I don't remember that. No,
I knew Webster used you quite a bit for one thing or another.
No, I didn't.
I didn't know if that was it or not. But I was there. I just didn't remember whether. I knew there was music, but it was such a mess because First Federal was the ones who were sponsoring it, and then boom, you've got everything open, the skies open up and whatnot. So
no, we did. The band, I met a lot of people through the band. Back in the early years, we opened for Flatt and Scruggs, and you know, we were in the same dressing room with them and got to meet them. And a lot of people over the years, I got one that stands out is Debbie Reynolds. Of course, when she was living in Roanoke, she did a concert here, and so we opened her concert. And I actually spent about an hour with Debbie. She was just the two of us talking. She was a just absolute sweetheart. She was a really, really down-to-earth, nice lady. She kicked her shoes off. A newspaper reporter had just been there, and she was all prim and proper, and he left, and she kicked her shoes off and put her feet up on the table and said, "Okay, now you're one of us, so we can talk." And we just had a really nice conversation. And then her husband at the time, Richard Hamlet, came home, and we went up to their bedroom, and he was showing these clips of Debbie's famous scenes, you know, from all the movies she did. And Debbie was serving hors d'oeuvres, and I was thinking, man, this is surreal. I can't, you know, I'm looking, you know, and here singing in the rain, Debbie Reynolds dancing, here she is, would you like another drink, you know? And that was a great memory of my life. But yeah, we met a lot of people over the years, and so the band was one of the good things that happened to me. So.
If you don't mind telling me, tell me about the play where you know there's no controlling what's going to take off and what's not going to. You just have to make your play, and just
yep.
you know the play didn't really work out for us as far as you becoming an international megala star. But it was fascinating, and I always admired that you and the other guys who were with it had the guts to do it.
Oh, you're talking about the Roanoke band?
Yeah, I'm talking about the Roanoke band, when you guys went and
Well, you know, it's funny, that Roanoke band, of course, didn't turn out well, but it's funny how when money gets involved, how that can change what's going on. Like, up until that time, we were just a little band playing around here and had a huge following. It was an enormously popular band, I immodestly say, but it was. And then all of a sudden, people wanted to get together and put together money to get the band back together, and which was great. And so we went. I mean, they got together something like $750,000, which was, you know, when that happens, you gotta kind of go with it, you know. And to me, it was my final decision was based on the fact that what if I didn't do this, because I would always wonder what would have happened. And but all of a sudden, all the money got involved, and we started feeling the pressure. And you know, it was so important for them for us to get a national manager. And we found this guy, Wes Farrell was his name, and he had a great track record, incredible track record. He worked with the Partridge Family, he knew all these people. And as it turned out, he wasn't right for us. He wanted to make us into a rock band, which we weren't. But you know, we had to go with what he said, and the way the people who had invested thought we ought to go. So, I mean, not that they all wanted us to go that way, but our manager was the main man. We had to do what he said, and so we did the record, and boy, we worked with some great people. Wes did know some great musicians and some good people to work with. But it just wasn't us. It just simply wasn't us. And I guess we knew that at the time, and I blame only myself. I feel like, man, I should have just said, hey, we're just not going to do this. But I didn't, because of the way. But it was the time. It was the way it was at the time. So we went with it, and I don't really regret it. It was just another one of those times in my life. A lot of good things happened during those 2 or 3 years that we tried that. So.
Oh, I was always, like I said, I was always real proud of it. I always
Well,
thought how cool it was that
I
some
wanna
guy who
have a
had
drink.
worked with me on the American National. Why do you think ROV had so many incredible people tramps through there? I don't know, did you ever formally work for Bert?
No, I never worked for Bert. I
But-
might as well have because I was there all the time, you know.
Just look at the roster of most every significant person in advertising in the early '70s, late '60s came through ROV at one point. What do you think that was?
Well, I think one thing is that Bert didn't rule with an iron hand. You know, he let the guys do what they wanted to do, and he got that reputation. And a lot of the disc jockeys really liked that idea. And Bert knew who was good. He could tell talent. He knew who would work on radio. And he was a good guy. I mean, everybody liked Bert. Well, he made some enemies, I guess, you know, like anybody would in that situation. But yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it was Bert. He just knew, you know, his reputation got out, and as being a good person to work for. And you're right. A lot of people did go through there who became very big in advertising, and it was, you know, it really was just a neat place. It was the old-fashioned radio station. Now you go into a radio station, there's a computer, and it's, you know, very sterile-like in there, you know. But back then, everybody smoked back then, and so there were, you know, ashtrays full of cigarette butts and all these old posters on the wall, and you know, certainly the desk, everything was just messed up kind of. But you know, it was the way radio was back then. The WKRP in Cincinnati. I don't know that. Remember that TV show? It was very much the way it was back in those days. But anyway, back to your question. Yeah, I think Bert was the reason that WROV was so successful.
You're a creative person. You've been involved with creative projects. You've done just virtually everything and on as many stages as just about anybody that's worked here. And you've worked with more people than almost anybody here. Why do you think it's important for a town like Roanoke to have a healthy creative community and people who understand the creative process? How do you think that makes it a better place to live for the guy who doesn't have anything to do with advertising?
Well, it certainly is reflected by what we see around here, you know. And I think, you see, I don't know if I guess I am sort of creative, but you know, I think creativity is just very important to not only, you know, the person, but to the surroundings. And you are creative. Tony is creative. I mean, there aren't, truthfully, honestly, I don't know. Well, first of all, I really don't know who the ad people are these days. I don't do that much work for people. Back in the old days, I did work for everybody, and everybody was creative. There were great people. Everybody I worked for was a good person, and also very creative. Dale, Jim, people at Edmunds Packet, I mentioned Glenn Overman and John Chapelski. These are names you don't remember, but they were. And John Chapelski went on to be a big ad guy. He did the oh gosh, he did some kind of, I can't remember what it was. Anyway, he did a very big national spot and did a lot of that stuff. I think, you know, to have creative people in your community is just a really important thing. I probably didn't answer that very well, but anyway, maybe there's some.
I've asked that same question.
You can edit it out.
We'll get you fine.
Don't ask such hard damn questions, Tom.
Yeah, I have to. I think it was Webster would always tell me about sometime when you were in Nashville. Back in those days, literally, you'd say, "Okay, here's your jingle," and you'd hold the phone up to the speakers. And he said that the client came back and said something like, "Could you have a little more Karen Carpenter and Conway Twitty in it," or something like that. Fred was doing it. Fred Kristafny was doing it. And he said that was the only one that he just ever
The
saw
Bank of White Sulphur Springs, I remember that. And
Tell me the story, because you can tell it firsthand, and I can't.
well, I did a jingle demo, which I did at my little studio, just me singing. And it was going to be a kind of a country thing. I was going to have a banjo playing and that was kind of big back then. And but the client said, I think it was Fred Christafany that said that he wanted it to be more like some of the people he mentioned was like 40s type music, And so, I had the session scheduled and everything. And so I went down. This is one thing about having great musicians. I just went down. I said, look, guys, forget this demo, the way it sounds. We've got to do it, like this. And the musicians did it. I mean, they just, the piano player put in some guitar licks, and the bass player played it the way they did back then, and the whole thing. And, the singers sang it the way that it was sung back then. And I can't say it's one of my favorite jingles by any means, but I think Fred Christafany liked it. I don't know if it did the client any good or not. Maybe it did, But oh yeah, I remember you mentioned that, and I thought of that time that I was doing music for a lot of people in Roanoke, and I did the Colonial American jingle for Harrison. And had finished the session, had the tape sitting on my desk, and Jim Webster called and wanted a jingle for FNEB, which of course was a direct competitor of Colonial American. And so I did something, he needed it real quickly. So I did something and I put it down, did a demo of it, and you came over and picked it up, as a matter of fact. And I picked up the tape, gave it to you, and Webster didn't have time to listen to it beforehand. He had to take it directly to the meeting, the presentation. And he put on the tape, and it was the Colonial American jingle. I'd picked up the wrong tape. So here he was, presenting to FNEB, and all of a sudden, Colonial American. But we got the jingle anyway, and it worked out. It turned out to be a really good jingle. I don't know which one was better. I won't say that even now, but it turned out to be a good jingle for FNEB. Anyway, it's just one of those things I remember. You won't use that, but there you go.
Oh, it's great. It's a great story. I'm not sure that I want. Have you enjoyed doing what you've done? I mean, you've had such a thing, and I know you're still working at it. I know you're not done yet, but have you enjoyed your career at this point? Oh,
absolutely. When I got into jingles, I always wanted to do music, but as you well know, as everybody knows, the profession of music is not exactly a lucrative one. You don't make a lot of money. Most people don't make a lot of money at it, and I didn't either. But it was what I wanted to do, and I loved doing it. And there was a while that I was making a little bit of money, and it was, I treasure. I mean, we had such a great amount, especially when I recorded in Atlanta. Such a great bunch of people. I mentioned WKRP. The same people played on my jingles that played on the WKRP stuff, because they, like the lead singer for WKRP that sung "Baby, If You've Ever Wondered" was a guy named Steve Carlisle, and he sang lead on a lot of the local jingles, like Davidson's I remember, and a whole bunch of them. And the other people I used were just great people and just a good team. And Nashville's different. You record in Nashville, much more businesslike and much more expensive, because the musicians charge for what's called cartage, is for people to carry their stuff to the studio. They do that anyway, even if they don't need everything. They just take all their stuff to the studio. It's one of those things. And it's just generally more expensive, and it's much more, like I say, it's much more business-like. People they get together and do what they're supposed to do. But in Atlanta, it was much more laid back. Everybody just had fun together, There's a lot I could relate about that that's pretty boring, that you wouldn't want to hear. But anyway, it was it was, a fun, just a great, doing music is what I do. It's what I do, and doing the jingles was a way to stay in music without, except that time I tried the Roanoke Band thing, without trying to be a star,
What's your favorite jingle that you've ever done? And I know that's not fair, because if you ask me, if you turn that on me and say, what's the favorite ad you ever done, I can probably get it down to half a dozen, but it'd be hard to do better than that.
Gosh, I don't know. There are a couple. In the early years, I would have to say, I did several Lindy's jingles, and like we talked about, and one of them was the one I sang actually, which I didn't sing many of them, but it was Peace, Love. Lindy's is peace, love, and strawberry pie, and they tell me who could ask for more. That one turned out, and when I first played that for Hartman, he said, peace, love, and effing strawberry pie. Are you kidding me? And I said, well, it's just what came to my mind, John. But it turned out to be a really successful jingle. I did one for Blue Cross Blue Shield of Florida, which was very successful for Glenn Overman a few years back. Did one I did for Blue Cross of Virginia for image advertising for Sharon. It's the #1 Get Well card from Blue Cross and Blue Shield. I should say the #1 Get Well card from Blue Cross and Blue Shield. For some reason, I tangled that up. And I don't know. Gosh, I don't know, Todd. I've done hundreds of the things. I don't know. Some of them I liked. Some of them I really didn't that much. I always felt I did the best I could on all of them. But some of them were good. Some of them were bad. Have you ever done anything bad? Probably not.
All the time. Actually, the things that I do worse are the things that I do average.
Yeah.
It didn't work out, and you have to get an idea out to see if it's going to work. And sometimes it doesn't.
Well, I think the best things I've ever done are the things that came to me right away. If you work too hard on something, that's where the rules start coming in. With me, gosh, I shouldn't do this because that just isn't, they say you shouldn't do this. But I think if you think too hard about something, that it comes out mediocre, But that's my experience anyway.
Yeah, that's great. You got any questions?
I don't think so.
You got anything you want to say that I didn't ask you about?
Nah?
All right. I had a great time.
Oh, well.
It's a joy.
Well.
Thanks, Kenny. I appreciate it.